A Lantern, Chapter 21. After Margaret's marriage, life seemed to move along in a monotonous regularity that summer. Letters came from her twice a week, and they were full of enthusiasm and plans. It was nice to have her so happily married, Abby thought. Mac did not write so often. When he did, the letter was brief and businesslike. He had received a raise in wages. The president himself commended him about something. Omaha was growing. You would be surprised to see how large it was getting. One gathered the impression from Mac that he was joint owner in all enterprises. Well, it was a good trait, Abby thought. Loyalty. It was nice for a boy to feel so much a part of a town. John was helping his father with farm work. A silent boy, Abby, looking at him curiously at times, wondered if she would ever understand him. Isabel, at 12, was practicing several hours a day with no coaxing. General Grant's Grand March and Dance of the Flowers. Sometimes in her interest over it she would forget time altogether and Abby would scold. Come, Isabel, too much of that at once isn't good for you. Little Grace at 18 months was toddling everywhere and into everything. It seemed to Abby that she pulled her out of one thing only to turn and see her getting into something else. She loved her deeply. Whatever would we have done without her, she would say to Will. There had been days of ordinary happenings in the summer of '89, until the heat of August hung over the land like a blanket. Abby had learned to know the prairie in all its moods, and the mood of August was the lazy, somnolent one. There was a noticeable decrease in the songs of the birds, for molting time had begun. Although one could hear the cardinals, what cheer, and the peewee calling his own name with a plaintive patience all through the day, and even after sunset and twilight, elderberry bushes massed along Stove Creek had exchanged their lacy headgear for black bonnets of ripe fruit. Along the grassy roadway, one's skirts touched Queen Anne's lace, field mustard and yarrow. Wild morning glories tangled through the grass, and the metallic beetles of iridescent red and green climbed the sticky stems of milkweeds. The yellow of sunflowers, the white of boneset, and the azure blue of chicory stood in friendly groups on all sides, and everywhere there were plumes of goldenrod, like plumes from the hats of lovely ladies. Spiders, the highwaymen of all insects, spread their webs in the pastures to hold up their victims. A covey of baby quail nearly full grown could be flushed almost any time a horse and rider crossed a field. And down by the creek bed, the mink and muskrat families had begun breaking home ties with the brown sons and daughters hunting for themselves. On one of these August afternoons, with the sun hot and the hollyhocks blood red against Abby's white pickets, with the sound of crooning hens outside the windows and a settled air of languor over the whole farm, Abby heard a sound of snorting horses, and looked out the east kitchen window to see John's team charging down the field, the knives of the mower close upon their heels, and John not in sight. With a horrible sensation of fright, so nightmarish that she seemed not able to pull her wooden limbs along, she ran out. John was lying against the barbed wire of the fence, white as the pickets of the garden gate, a sickening stream of scarlet trickling from his foot. Ill at the sight, Abby ran to a small new plum tree and broke off its top. She pulled up the lower barbed wire of the fence and crawled through, snatching off her apron and binding it above the ankle, with the plum stick knotted in between. John's eyes opened and clung in fright to his mother. "Mother, do something for me," he moaned, in the old little boy way. Abby heard someone, who seemed not herself, saying in a steady voice, "Yes, John, trust Mother." The horses, frothing now at the bits and flanks, were standing against the fence at the far side of the field, trying to reach green corn ears over the wire. Across the hay stubble, Abby ran to them. On the way, she kept saying, "Oh God, one more thing. Help me through this one more thing." With frantic movements, she unhitched and led the team back into the yard and hitched them to the lumber wagon. She seemed to have acquired an Amazonian strength. Isabel, who ran out, was crying in silent fright. "Bring pillows from the beds," Abby called. Back into the field she drove in the wagon. Fearful to leave the horses, which had not yet settled down to their usual docility, she tied them to the fence post. "Mother, do something." "Yes, John, trust Mother." Together, Abby and Isabel, pulling and lifting, got the suffering boy into the wagon with his head on a pillow. Already the apron was scarlet. Abby jerked off the wagon seat, piling the other pillows on it, propped up the mangled foot. She jumped out, untied the team, and climbed back over the wheel into the wagon box. "Look after the baby," she called to Isabel, and started the horses out of the field on a gallop. Against the dashboard she stood and clung to the lines, which almost cut her as they sawed through her hands. The wagon bounced and careened and rocked. The pins came from Abby's hair, and the red-brown mass faded now, and with a few graying streaks fell over her shoulders. In Cedartown, people ran out of their houses and looked after her. As she reached Dr. Hornby's, she had to use all her strength to get the team stopped. Men running out from the little stores came to help, catching the horses by the bits and tying them to the long row of hitching posts. Dr. Hornby and Henry Lutz and A.Z. Drum carried the boy into the one-story office. "Stand by me, Mother." "Yes, John, I won't leave you." Abby held the boy's hand. Her thick hair still tumbled over her shoulders while Dr. Hornby cut and cleansed and tied. When the last neat bandage was fastened, Abby Deal slipped to the floor in a crumpled heap. John's life was saved only by a few moments, only by the time gained through Abby's wild drive into town. For weeks, his foot propped in its one position, he suffered all the agonies of a cut and tortured tendon of Achilles, and always he was to carry a horny scar. It was the nearest that death had come to the family since Abby's long illness. Will and Abby, sitting on the side porch on a warm August evening, talked of it in low tones. "Death, Will," Abby said. "How the fear of it always hangs over me. If John had died—" "Death," Will repeated. "Death." He looked beyond the Lombardy poplars, stared for a moment up into the deepening prairie twilight. "I wonder why we fear it." He spoke as though to himself. "The naturalness of it. Wild geese flying over, cattle coming home, birds to their nests, leaves to the winter mold, the fast sleep. How natural they all are, and yet of them all we fear only the sleep. When my time comes, I wish my family and friends could think of it that way, without tears." "Oh, Will, don't talk so. If you should be taken away from me, I couldn't stand it." "Oh, yes, you could, Abby girl. You could stand it. It's the people who have loved and then lost their love, who have failed each other in some way, who couldn't stand it. With you and me, all we've been through together and all we've meant to each other, with us, it couldn't be so terrible. Nothing could take away the past from us. You are so much a part of me that if you were taken away, I think it would seem that you just went on with me. And I'm sure if I were the one taken, I would go on with you, remembering all you had been to me." So seldom did Will speak that which was in his heart, and now he had spoken. Abby sat and looked out into the star-filled sky. There were the summer night odors, clover, hay, and ripening apples and sweet alyssum. There were the summer night sounds, cicada and frogs and a crooning bird. There were the summer night movements, the trembling of the leaves on the poplars, a nighthawk dipping low, a bit of lacy cloud slipping across the moon. For a moment, Abby Deal seemed greater than herself, larger than humanity. For a brief time, a sense of deep wisdom was within her. A flood of infinite strength and peace enveloped her. "I would go on with you, remembering." All fall and early winter, John, suffering, blue, discouraged, was kept in with his bad foot. It had been a terrible cut, but it was healing, and he was not going to be crippled thanks to the ministrations of a country doctor with few instruments and meager equipment, but with a sound surgical knowledge. Young Dr. Frederick Baker commented on the old doctor's care of the case with the cheerful condescension of the recent graduate. By studying at home and taking his tests, John was able to graduate with his class at the academy. Still favoring his foot a little, he went into the field with his father. That summer of '90 was the summer of the great drought. Day after day, Will came into the kitchen with the pails of morning milk to say, "Another scorcher, not a cloud in the sky." The hot, belching winds blew in from the southwest. The grass in the pastures nodded and scorched on its roots. The brittle leaves of weeds rattled like so many tiny castanets whenever the chickens walked through them. Blackberries hardened on the bushes and fell to the ground. Raspberries were purple warts. Peaches dried in the forming. The small grain amounted to very little. The corn began to curl and brown and bake on its roots. Crops were stillborn in the womb of nature. Reports from other parts of the country were the same. The state seemed to have slipped backward into its beginnings, to be going through the same hard period experienced in the 70s. Rumor came from the northern border that the Indians were dancing the ghost dance. Abby commenced to wish the family had not been so extravagant, buying the organ and the carpet and building on the room. That joke of hers about the fall of Rome was beginning to seem ill-timed. But the bad summer seemed not to bother the children. Grace was 2.5 now. A smart little tyke, everyone said. Margaret came home sometimes, but her young doctor husband was too fearful of missing a case in the growing town of Lincoln to leave often. Margaret was as happy as Abby had ever wished her to be. She was busy, too, with her painting, reveling in the time and opportunity to work with it. She brought sketches out to show Abby, and the two spent long moments talking them over. Mac had good reports to make. Whenever he came for an occasional Sunday in his friendly, breezy way, Abby always felt a renewal of pride in his virile young manhood, a feeling of elation over his unceasing energy. People like Mac, she'd say to Will, but what's better, they have confidence in him. John was Will's standby in the farm work, quiet, serious, seldom speaking his mind. He seemed to Abby more and more like Will. Isabel was talking and thinking music all day. She was taking lessons now from a woman in Cedartown. Abby always drove with her over to town on Saturday afternoons. While Isabel took her lesson, Abby traded out the butter and eggs she had brought to the Lutz store. One late Sunday afternoon in October, as Abby was taking Isabel over to town for her music lesson, she met Dr. Fred and Margaret riding out to home with Oscar Lutz. They had come on the late afternoon train to surprise the home folks. A warm feeling of happiness was with Abby when she drove the old white mare back toward the lane road by the Lombardy poplars. Mac was coming the next day, too. Never did life seem so complete as when the children were all at home. Home was the hub of the wheel. Always she and Will would live there, and always, no matter where the children's activities led them, they would come home to father and mother in the white farmhouse behind the cedars. She was thinking this in a general way, and that she would have chicken and hot biscuits for Sunday supper, when she turned into the lane road by the poplars. Everyone was out by the windmill. John, Margaret, Dr. Fred Baker, Grace, Oscar Lutz, Gus Reinmuller. They were standing in a group, a quiet, silent group, only standing and doing nothing. Something smote Abby like a chilling hand. Clutching at her heart and throat, there was complete silence in the crowd, a whispering silence. The same hushed silence of the time when the baby was born dead. They all turned when she came up the lane road, turned toward her, but did not move, looked at her, and were silent. Abby got out of the buggy with wooden movements and went over to the group. Dr. Fred Baker was kneeling on the grass. By his side, Will lay at the foot of the windmill, staring beyond the Lombardy poplars. Abby knelt down by him too, but he did not look at her. He only lay and looked beyond the Lombardy poplars, stared up into the deepening prairie twilight. Oscar Lutz's voice, hoarse and far away, said, "Is he?" Dr. Fred's low and far away also said, "Yes, gone." He turned his head away and slipped a hand gently over Will's eyelids. Gus Reinmuller gave a sob. Oscar Lutz said, "There was a man." The children, John, Margaret, Isabel, little Grace, all began to cry wildly. Abby Deal dragged her eyes away from Will and looked across the prairie as towards Golgotha. No one moved. There was no sound but the children crying. The cows were coming up to the pasture gate. The leaves of the Lombardy poplars floated onto the lane road. A bird flew into the cedars. A long wedge-shaped line of geese flew low. Will lay sleeping. Suddenly, Abby Deal seemed greater than herself, larger than humanity. A sense of deep wisdom was within her. A flood of infinite strength enveloped her. She rose and threw up her head. "Hush!" she said quietly to the children. Almost sternly she said it. "Hush! Not a child of Will Deal's is to shed a tear."